What happens when the youngest voice in the monarchy speaks a truth no one dares to utter? Prince George's chilling words, calling Queen Camilla the enemy, did not remain a child's whisper. They became the lightning strike that split the palace in two. Those within the gilded walls had grown accustomed to whispers, to secrets exchanged in corridors, and half-finished sentences cut off by the echo of footsteps. But never before had such words come from a child, and certainly not from the boy who carries the destiny of the crown. The remark did not feel like an innocent slip. It felt like a verdict. In one breath, George had pierced through decades of carefully crafted silence, leaving everyone scrambling to understand what it truly meant. The story of how those words reached the ears of the royal household has already become the stuff of legend. At first, it was said to be an overheard comment, something spoken in the company of his siblings, never meant to travel beyond a nursery room. Yet the way it spread suggested more than chance. Within hours, trusted aides were whispering, their faces pale, as if carrying a message too dangerous to repeat aloud. The phrase was short, sharp, and utterly damning. She is the enemy. No explanation was offered, but none was needed. In a palace haunted by the ghost of Diana and burdened by years of uneasy alliances, the meaning was clear. And so the questions began to swirl. How could a boy so young see so deeply into the fracture lines of the monarchy? His words did not feel like mischief or malice. They carried with them an uncanny clarity, as though George had been born with the ability to sense what adults tried desperately to conceal. His upbringing had been shielded, his innocence protected. Yet even the most carefully managed walls could not hide the sharp edge of tension that cut through family dinners, ceremonies, and late-night arguments muffled behind locked doors. To George, Camilla was not merely a step-grandmother. She was a figure that stood between his father's destiny, his mother's dignity, and the memory of the grandmother he never knew but had been told was the embodiment of love and compassion. For the aides who heard it, the weight of the remark was staggering. Palace staff had endured scandals, betrayals, and endless waves of headlines. But this was different. This was not a tabloid claim or a political whisper. This was the raw, unfiltered perception of the boy who would one day be king. Some froze in silence, refusing to acknowledge the remark at all. Others exchanged nervous glances, knowing that to repeat it was to invite chaos. And yet, in a house where loyalty and betrayal often dance too close to one another, it was inevitable that the phrase would reach Camilla herself. Her camp moved quickly to contain it. They dismissed it as childish nonsense, a silly remark not worth the ink of scandal. But behind their carefully chosen words, Camilla herself seethed. To be painted as an enemy, especially by the heir's son, was not just an insult. It was a threat to everything she had built, every sacrifice she had made to carve out her place at Charles's side. In private, her fury was unmistakable. To those closest to her, she vowed that no child, however royal, would tarnish her crown. Yet, even as Camilla plotted her defense, those within the palace knew the truth. George's words could not be dismissed so easily. They were not the ramblings of a mischievous boy. They were the kind of words that take root, whispered again and again, until they transform into prophecy. The monarchy, so often shaken from the outside, now found itself rattled from within, its future heir declaring war before he even wore the crown. The remark did not disappear into silence. It grew, echoing down hallways, carried by hushed voices, too afraid to stop repeating it. But whispers in the palace do not fade. They spread like wildfire, forcing everyone to remember where this all truly began. Behind every shocking statement lies a history of silent wars. George's words carried weight because they were born from an atmosphere already poisoned with suspicion. What seemed to erupt in a single moment was, in truth, the culmination of years of unspoken tension, glances exchanged across rooms, and grudges carefully tucked behind ceremonial smiles. The monarchy thrives on silence, but silence has a way of feeding distrust until even the youngest can sense its shadow. For George, calling Camilla the enemy was not the whim of a child. It was an instinct sharpened by what he had seen, what he had felt, and what his parents had endured long before he could speak of it aloud. The fracture between William and Camilla had never been healed. Their relationship was born out of necessity, not affection, and each interaction carried the heaviness of history. William, fiercely protective of his mother's memory, often bristled at Camilla's presence, his restraint visible, but his distance undeniable. George, watching silently from the corners of grand dining halls or family gatherings, absorbed more than anyone realized. Children see not through words, but through atmospheres. They know when their parents are uneasy, when a smile is forced, when tension thickens the air, and George knew. Each strained exchange between William and Camilla carved itself into his memory, layering into an unspoken lesson about loyalty and betrayal. Catherine, too, played her part in shaping George's quiet perception. Her teachings were subtle, wrapped in stories of heritage and honor, but the lessons were clear. Loyalty is sacred, legacy is fragile, and truth must never be compromised. In her gentle way, she reminded her children that their grandmother Diana was more than just a figure in history books. She was a symbol of compassion and resilience, and her absence was no accident of fate. George listened, he connected, and from those whispers of legacy, a sharper awareness grew. He began to sense who truly stood for the family's honor, and who threatened it. For Camilla, the wound she had left on Diana's memory was one she tried to bury under layers of ceremony and public service. But actions have echoes. Every time Camilla dismissed a commemoration, avoided a reference, or sought to reposition herself as the central figure in the royal story, George noticed. He saw his father's jaw tighten, his mother's eyes dim, and the staff around them lowered their voices. To a child, those small cracks were louder than speeches. To George, Camilla's very presence became an insult to the legacy he had been taught to cherish. In his young mind, she was not simply another royal. She was the shadow that threatened to erase the light of the past. Among the younger royals, whispers about Camilla lingered too. Though never spoken directly in George's presence, he could feel the undercurrent. His cousins, his aunt, even members of the extended family seemed to carry a quiet skepticism around her. For George, these unspoken judgments reinforced what he already believed. Camilla was tolerated, not embraced. She was a presence at the table, but never truly part of the family's heart. That cold truth seeped into George's consciousness until it hardened into certainty. The truth is that George's declaration was not born in a vacuum. It was the result of years of observation, of absorbing the bitterness that lingered in the palace halls long after the cameras had left. His words, shocking as they sounded, were not new. They were the unfiltered expression of what had been simmering all along. The seeds of distrust had been planted well before his time, and by the moment he finally spoke, they had already grown into something that could no longer be ignored. And as these seeds of distrust grew, one encounter would turn quiet unease into open confrontation. Few moments are more dangerous than a child breaking the silence in front of elders. George's words weren't whispered. This time, they were spoken aloud, directly within Camilla's earshot. The setting was a private family gathering, meant to be a rare evening of calm, a dinner where laughter and pleasantries could mask the undercurrents of rivalry. But beneath the polished silver and the forced smiles, the atmosphere was already strained. The weight of history sat at the table with them, and no one could have anticipated that it would be a child who shattered the illusion. The moment arrived with no warning. George, seated quietly and watching the exchange between his father and Camilla, suddenly broke the silence. His voice carried not the playfulness of youth, but the sharpness of truth. "You're the enemy." The room froze. It was as if time itself halted, leaving only the echo of those words reverberating through every heart present. Aides, usually so skilled in smoothing over awkward pauses, were paralyzed. Their eyes darted from George to Camilla, then back to the royals at the head of the table, waiting for someone to break the unbearable silence. But no one dared. Camilla's face betrayed the fury she fought to contain. She knew all eyes were upon her, waiting for a reaction. For a brief moment, her expression hardened, her control slipping. Then, with the cold calculation of a seasoned survivor, she forced a laugh. "Children do say the silliest things," she remarked, her voice light but trembling at the edges. It was an attempt to dismiss the remark, to frame it as nothing more than a childish outburst. But the tremor in her tone betrayed the wound it struck. The mask of humor could not conceal the sting of being called what she had feared for years, the enemy within. William's eyes locked on his son with both pride and apprehension. He said nothing, but the tightening of his jaw, the steadying of his posture, told its own story. He would not rebuke George. He would not allow Camilla's camp to twist his son's words into mischief. Catherine, ever composed, placed a gentle hand on George's arm, not to silence him, but to shield him from the storm she knew was coming. Her gaze fell on Camilla, cool and unwavering, as if daring her to retaliate. The silence between the two women carried more power than any spoken word dot around the room. Reactions fractured. Some gasped openly, their shock written across their faces. Others averted their eyes, unwilling to acknowledge the weight of what had just been said. Aides whispered prayers under their breath that the words would not leave the palace walls, knowing all too well that secrets rarely remain confined. Denial battled recognition, but none could shake the feeling that something irreversible had occurred. George had said aloud what many thought in private, but dared not utter, and in doing so, he had torn through the delicate fabric of unity the monarchy tried so hard to preserve. What began as one child's words was now a crisis too large to contain, forcing the monarchy into a dangerous choice. The palace is no stranger to divisions, but never had such a split been caused by a child's truth. Now, two camps began forming, one shielding George, the other protecting Camilla. The impact of those three words, "You're the enemy," had spread like a crack through marble. Impossible to repair and impossible to ignore. What should have been dismissed as a child's outburst had instead drawn invisible battle lines across the royal household. The question was no longer whether the remark was serious. It was who would defend it and who would bury it. William was the first to make his stance clear. He stood firmly behind his son, his silence more powerful than any official statement could ever be. By refusing to reprimand George, William sent a message that rang louder than words. His son had spoken the truth, and he would not betray him by denying it. For William, this was more than family loyalty. It was a defense of Diana's memory, a refusal to allow her legacy to be trampled beneath the weight of palace politics. In George's declaration, he saw the same courage that once defined his mother, and he could not turn his back on it. Catherine, however, felt the cost more acutely. In the stillness of private chambers, she confessed her fears for George's safety. Not in the sense of physical harm, but of what the palace could do to silence him. She knew the monarchy's way of dealing with those who spoke out. Isolate them, discredit them, paint their words as nonsense until the truth is buried beneath ridicule. Her worry was not just for George's childhood innocence, but for the man he was destined to become. Would the system punish him for daring to speak too soon, or would it crush his spirit before the crown ever touched his head? Camilla, on the other hand, refused to allow the insult to pass unanswered. She demanded loyalty from Charles, pressing him to take her side with a ferocity that reopened wounds thought long sealed. Old arguments resurfaced, the ones whispered, about for decades that her place in the monarchy had been bought with persistence and scandal, that her crown had been earned through endurance rather than devotion. For her, George's remark was not a boy's defiance, but a dagger to her throne. And she was determined to ensure it did not cut deeper. Caught in the middle was Charles, torn between the three pillars of his fractured life: his son, his wife, and his grandson. To support George would mean undermining Camilla, the woman he had fought so hard to legitimize in the eyes of the nation. To support Camilla would mean turning against William and alienating the boy who represented the future of the crown. His indecision bred resentment on all sides, for every moment of hesitation appeared as weakness. And in a monarchy where strength is survival, weakness is unforgivable. Advisors, desperate to salvage stability, warned of catastrophe should George's words ever reach beyond palace walls. They feared that the monarchy's carefully controlled image would collapse under the weight of a child's unfiltered truth. They knew the public adored George and Catherine, and to hear the young prince label Camilla the enemy would tilt the balance of sympathy irreversibly. They urged silence, secrecy, and immediate damage control. But the tension was too deep to be confined, seeping through doors and echoing in the servants' quarters until it spread like smoke. From the grand halls to the quiet corridors, the palace became a battlefield of whispers. Staff aligned themselves in hushed loyalties, some quietly admiring George's honesty, others fearing the wrath of the queen consort. Family dinners turned into tense affairs where every word was measured, every glance dissected, every silence louder than speech. The truth was simple. The monarchy had been divided before, but this was different. This was not politics, nor public scandal. This was blood against bond, truth against power, innocence against survival, and no one could predict which side would prevail. Yet, even as the palace fractured, the outside world was about to hear the echo of George's words. Once whispered inside the palace, the phrase, "the enemy," burst into headlines, transforming a family dispute into an international spectacle. What began as a private remark, carried from one uneasy corridor to another, now stood emblazoned across newspaper covers and flashed on television screens. Someone within those guarded walls had let it slip, and the press wasted no time turning a child's words into a global thunderstorm. The monarchy, which thrived on secrecy and silence, suddenly found itself exposed, its fractures laid bare for the world to see. The tabloids, ever hungry for scandal, framed the story in ways that cut deep. They hailed George as the heir to Diana's spirit, the boy who, even in his innocence, carried the same sharp clarity that had once unsettled the palace establishment. Headlines screamed of destiny fulfilled, of Diana's legacy speaking through her grandson. The narrative was irresistible, one generation gone, another rising, armed with the courage to call out betrayal where others had chosen silence. For the public, George was no longer just a young prince. He was a truth-teller, a beacon of honesty in an institution known for its guarded lies. Public sympathy swelled almost overnight. Across the nation, people spoke of George with admiration, remarking on his bravery and instinct. Many saw his words as not merely childish defiance, but a cry that echoed what the public had long believed, that Camilla had never truly belonged. Every retelling of the remark grew bolder, every editorial sharper, until the Queen Consort was no longer the dutiful wife of the king in the eyes of many, but a figure cast as the villain in a play she thought she had mastered. The press painted her as the usurper, the obstacle standing in the way of Diana's rightful heirs, and no matter how many palace statements were released, the tide of public opinion began to turn against her with relentless force. The monarchy's PR machine scrambled desperately to regain control. Carefully worded statements poured out, attempting to soften the blow by insisting that George's words had been misunderstood or taken out of context. Royal commentators were enlisted to explain away the remark as the natural imagination of a child too young to grasp reality. Yet, the harder they tried to silence the storm, the more it grew. For every official denial, the public's conviction deepened. The palace had underestimated the raw power of the phrase. The enemy had slipped beyond their grasp and taken on a life of its own, a rallying cry repeated in whispers, conversations, and protests alike. And then came the global reaction. International outlets seized the story with fascination, each nation interpreting it through its own lens. To some, it was evidence of a monarchy in decline, torn apart from within. To others, it was a prophecy of a young prince daring to speak truth before even wearing the crown. The world asked, was this a childish slip, a moment of naivety magnified by scandal? Or was it something far greater, a glimpse of the monarchy's future, spoken through the mouth of a boy destined to reign? But behind the glossy covers and screaming headlines, the royal family's private world was falling apart. If George was the voice, Catherine became the shield. The mother who had endured silent battles now faced her fiercest role yet, protecting her son from the wrath of the Queen Consort. While the palace erupted in whispers and factions began to form, Catherine drew her son close, ensuring that the storm swirling around him would not extinguish his courage. She knew the weight of the words George had spoken, and though they had placed him in danger, she would not let him bear that weight alone. In hushed moments, away from the eyes of courtiers and advisers, she reassured him that he had not done wrong, that truth spoken in innocence was not a crime, but a sign of strength. Her resolve was unshakable. Catherine had witnessed firsthand how the palace machine could silence, distort, and crush those who dared to stand apart. She had seen it done to Diana, and she knew Camilla would stop at nothing to frame George's remark as reckless or harmful. But Catherine swore that her son would not be made an example of, Not this time. She became his quiet defender, protecting him not with grand declarations, but with subtle acts of resistance, shielding him from prying questions, refusing to let aides interrogate him, and standing firm against suggestions that he be reprimanded for his own good. Behind every one of George's words stood Catherine, steady and unyielding, ensuring that silence would not be forced upon him, yet her stance came at a cost. Tension with Charles deepened in ways few could imagine. The king, desperate to preserve unity, urged Catherine to soften her defense, to allow the matter to be quietly swept aside. To him, the survival of the monarchy outweighed the feelings of a child, no matter how significant his place in the line of succession. But Catherine's answer was unwavering. Her son's truth was not to be erased. The more Charles pushed for compromise, the more Catherine bristled against it. And what emerged was a clash of wills between a king determined to protect his wife and a mother determined to protect her child. In these moments of conflict, Catherine's influence grew in ways Camilla could neither ignore nor diminish. She was no longer simply William's wife or George's mother. She became the embodiment of the next generation's strength, the guardian of the future crown. Every word she spoke in defense of her son was a reminder to the palace that her authority did not stem from titles or decrees, but from her role as the mother of the kings to come. And with each passing day, her presence loomed larger, casting a shadow that Camilla could not dispel. Late at night, when the palace quieted and the echoes of the day's battles faded, Catherine and William spoke of the legacy they carried. They reflected on Diana, the woman whose absence was still felt in every corner of their lives. For Catherine, protecting George was not only about shielding him from Camilla's wrath, it was about preserving the flame Diana had lit. In George's words, she had heard Diana's voice, and she knew that if Camilla was the enemy, then she, herself, had been called to be the protector. Catherine's strength was quiet but unbreakable. She did not need to raise her voice or issue commands. Her power came from her resolve, her ability to endure, and her refusal to bow to pressure. She became the wall between George and the palace's attempts to rewrite his truth. In doing so, she became a force Camilla could not bend, a reminder that some battles are not fought with crowns or titles, but with the unyielding love of a mother who will not let her child be destroyed. And while Catherine shielded her child, Camilla was plotting her next move with vengeance in her heart. A queen consort humiliated in the court of public opinion is the most dangerous opponent of all. Camilla was determined to strike back, no matter the cost. She had endured decades of criticism, weathered years of being cast as the interloper, and clawed her way to the crown with sheer resilience. But now, with one sentence from a child, the ground beneath her feet had begun to crumble. To Camilla, silence was not an option. Retaliation was not just necessary. It was survival. Her first demand was chilling in its clarity. There had to be a disciplinary response to George. No matter his age, no matter his innocence, Camilla insisted that the words of the future king could not go unchecked. She pressed Charles to take action, framing the matter not as a family dispute, but as a crisis of authority. If the monarchy could not control its own heir, how could it command respect from the outside world? To Camilla, punishing George would send a message that no one, not even the young prince, was above the order she sought to impose. But her ambitions did not stop there. Camilla's influence pressed deeper into the household, and whispers began to circulate of her allies pushing to seize control of George's education. If she could not silence him directly, she would mold him, surrounding him with tutors and mentors loyal to her vision. To those in her circle, this was framed as guidance. To others, it was nothing less than an attempt to reshape the boy into something more compliant, something less dangerous to her crown. The idea alone sent tremors through the palace, igniting a fury in William that could no longer be contained. The confrontation between father and son was inevitable. William, who had stood silently for so long, finally broke through the veneer of respect to challenge Charles directly. He accused Camilla of overreach, of manipulating the throne to shield herself while threatening the very child who would one day inherit it. Charles, torn between loyalty to his wife and duty to his family, faltered. His inability to choose deepened the rift, with William's defiance echoing Diana's long shadow. the wounds of the past reopened, sharper now because they were tied to the future of George. And then came Anne. Known for her restraint and blunt pragmatism, she rarely involved herself in family disputes. Yet this time, her quiet fury aligned with William. She did not shout, nor did she publicly denounce Camilla, but her disapproval was unmistakable. In her presence, Charles could feel the weight of judgment, the unspoken reminder that blood loyalty must come before political alliances. Her subtle support gave William strength, and her silence toward Camilla spoke volumes louder than any open condemnation. But, in her desperation, Camilla made a critical miscalculation. The harder she fought to suppress George's words, the stronger they seemed to grow. Each attempt to discredit him, each whisper of punishment, only cemented the idea that he had spoken something powerful enough to frighten a queen. Rather than diminish the remark, her counterattack elevated it, turning it into a rallying cry. What was meant to silence him instead magnified his voice, leaving her looking weaker with every move. But the real test came not from palace politics, but from George himself. As he stood his ground once more, in the eyes of millions, he was just a boy. But in the heart of the monarchy, George had already shown the spirit of a future king, unafraid to name the enemy. The weight of his words had grown heavier with every passing day. Yet instead of shrinking beneath the scrutiny, George displayed a resilience that startled even those closest to him. What could have been dismissed as a childish slip had become something far greater. A statement of defiance, a signal of destiny. And through it all, George remained calm, carrying himself with the quiet certainty of someone who seemed to know his role was larger than anyone dared admit. Even in the privacy of family life, George's questions unsettled his parents. He asked William why some truths must be hidden. And he asked Catherine why love and loyalty so often come with sacrifice. These were not the idle musings of a child, but profound reflections that revealed the sharpness of his mind. Catherine, caught between pride and sorrow, saw in her son the same clarity that had defined Diana, the same refusal to accept hypocrisy disguised as duty. William, too, recognized the echo of his mother's fire, and it filled him with both hope and fear. I hope that George could one day lead with that honesty. Fear that such honesty might cost him everything. The public, however, had already chosen their side. Crowds that once merely admired George as a young prince now spoke of him as something more, a symbol of truth in an institution long accused of secrecy and deception. People rallied behind him, praising his courage and embracing him as the embodiment of Diana's legacy. To them, George was not just the heir to the crown. He was the boy who dared to say what so many believed but never thought would be spoken within palace walls. In his voice, they heard justice. In his defiance, they saw hope. Within the palace, aides whispered in hushed tones that this boy carried his grandmother's fire. They said it cautiously, as though invoking Diana's name might reignite old wars, but the thought lingered all the same. Diana had once exposed truths the monarchy wished to bury, and now her grandson had lit the same flame. For the staff who had lived through the turbulence of the past, it felt like history repeating itself, only this time in the body of a child who had not yet even reached the throne. Quietly, the monarchy began to shift. Though no official admission was made, those at the top understood that George had changed the narrative forever. What had begun as a single outburst had reshaped how the public saw the royal family. Camilla was no longer at the center of the story. Instead, all eyes turned to George, the boy who had spoken without fear, the child who might one day reign with a courage unseen in generations. And while the palace tried to repair the cracks, it could not erase the truth that had been spoken. For George had shown the world not just who he was, but who he was destined to become. Yet even as George's star rose, the question lingered. What would this mean for Camilla's place in history? The monarchy has weathered scandals, betrayals, and wars, but never before had its future been threatened by a child's words. George's declaration marked a turning point. Would Camilla survive it, or would history remember her only as the enemy? Inside the palace, her authority began to wither. What once felt like command now felt like isolation. her influence unraveling thread by thread as whispers grew louder and loyalties shifted away. Charles, caught in the shadow of his own choices, carried a silence heavy with regret that his devotion to Camilla had cost him harmony with his son and strained the bond with his grandson. William and Catherine, however, emerged stronger than ever, their resolve hardened by the storm. Together, they stood not only as protectors of George, but as guardians of a legacy greater than themselves. And at the heart of it all stood the boy who spoke without fear. To the public, George became the voice of truth, the embodiment of innocence. Daring to confront power, the child who carried Diana's fire into a new age, the scandal refused to fade, etched permanently into memory, retold as a story of courage against deception. And so, a single phrase from a child has now etched itself into the crown's history, leaving one truth behind: the monarchy will never be the same again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.